But I was really interested in this research. So this research was conducted by Angela Duckworth, and she's a professor at Penn State. She's a researcher, and she's also the recipient of the MacArthur Genius Award. And so she tells a really funny personal story. This is, essentially why she got interested in what the key success factors were. So she was looking out at the top people in, a pretty broad array of fields, from top business leaders, military leaders, athletes, people that won the National Spelling Bee, really tough public school systems. And what she was chasing after, she wanted to know, is there just one key predictor of success, right? So a common trait that was present in all of these different populations. And so the genesis of this project really kind of came out of a personal story for her. So she talks about in her book, when she was growing up, her father always said, well, Angela, you're really competent, but you're no genius, right? And, so it's really ironic, she winds up winning the MacArthur Genius Award. But this was always kind of in the back of her mind, right? So if I'm no genius, why have I excelled at almost everything that I've done in my life? So clearly, intellect isn't the only factor that influences success rates. So what she did was she started looking at some of the places where some of the most elite go, right? And so she went to West Point, and she went to investigate what their admissions criteria was, and whether or not those admissions criteria, helped them to predict who was going to make it through these really, really tough programs and who wasn't. And so what she found at West Point, and also with the Navy SEALs, is that they spent a lot of time on these metrics, really thinking about how they could ensure that the majority of the people that they admitted, and again, their admissions were so rigorous that roughly only about 2% of the people that applied ever really got into any of these institutions. And yet, of those that actually made it in, even though they had scored really high on all of the metrics that they had aggregated, to get them into these institutions, very few of them actually made it through. In fact, more than 50% of them dropped out in the first few weeks. And she was really interested, if it's this tough, to get into West Point, you actually have to get a letter of recommendation from a congressman, right? It's not easy to do, amongst everything else that you have to do. So to be a high achiever and to reach, for something that is really out of the realm of most people, and to actually be accepted, right, is a very, very challenging thing to do. So what was it that caused them to fail ultimately to complete the program? So she also looked at, interesting that I think she also selected this sample pool, was like timeshare salesmen, right? We usually don't correlate them with like Navy SEALs and like West Point cadets, right? But the type of environment that they worked in on a daily basis, really hard. So typically they work 100% on commissions, right? It's a very uncertain kind of environment. Like if they can't make a sale, they don't make a paycheck, right? There's also a really high rejection rate. Have any of you been to a timeshare sales presentation? Yeah. So, what's the motivation for going? You get some kind of freebie, right? You're in Maui, you get like a free helicopter ride, or, that's what you go for. And you're like, oh, I'll sit through 90 minutes. So I'm not going to buy anything. And they know this, but, and their conversion rates are really, really, really low, right? And that requires really long hours. So they have to work really hard in an environment of high uncertainty, and most often than not, they're going to fail. Does that sound familiar? Does that sound like a familiar environment to you? Yeah? Okay, so, and then, of course, then she also went out to the Chicago public schools, right? And again, right, you kind of have to worry that, you know, a Chicago public school system is correlated with some of these other, like, really, really tough places to survive. But she wanted to know, like, for those who actually succeeded in one of the toughest school systems in the nation, like, what was it that set those students apart, right? So, you know, she looked at intelligence and high test scores, a sense of safety, like whether the students were bullied, or if, you know, if they felt safe enough in the school environment that they could actually pay attention to their studies, or extracurricular activities. So some of the research that comes out of the success rates at high schools and even middle schools are really reflect on what the students do outside of school. So are they in sports? Are they in music? You know, do they do things or participate in things that are really challenging outside of the academic arena? And so a lot of her research was actually based on this research done by a professor at Stanford by the name of Carol Dweck. And Carol wrote a book called Mindset. I highly recommend it. It will help you to understand the mindset that you really want to develop in your courses with your students to prepare them for what they have to do in your courses or in your accelerators. What Carol focused on was the attitudes towards the ability to learn and attitudes towards failure, right? And so what she found is that if you believe you can do it, so if you believe that you can learn and grow and develop, then you can, right? If you believe you can't, you won't. Right? So if you believe that, for example, you can learn entrepreneurship, you can learn how to be an entrepreneur, it's much more likely that you'll be successful in an entrepreneurship class. If you don't believe it, right, you won't, or you may never even enter that arena. Okay, so she was one of the early researchers in brain plasticity. So our old thought process was that, you know, you have a fixed intelligence, you have fixed personality, you can learn certain tasks, but generally, what you know is, has limits, right? You have a question?
Yeah, because I found a very interesting common point, which is you can be a regular Navy or a Navy SEAL. You can be a regular real estate seller or, a timeshare seller. And mostly, I think that they choose, which is for more common perspective, the hardest way to do things. Not the hardest way.
Yeah. Highly challenging.
Yeah, I think so, but from their perspective, it's not that challenging. It's the best way.
It's the best way. So, and that's also a common trait with people who are really at the top of their fields. They're constantly trying to improve, always, right? Looking for a way to do something better. So what she found is that people with what she calls the growth mindset, right, are much more likely to persevere through great challenges, hard tasks, and failure, right? Because they just don't believe that failure is a permanent condition, right? That, there's no moving forward from it. So people with a fixed mindset tend to believe that intelligence and potential are just set in stone. It's just, you're born with it, whatever it is, whatever your intelligence and ability factor is, it's unchangeable. People with this mindset tend to want to look smart to others, right? As a result of that, they avoid challenges, and they don't they see failure as kind of a personal failing, right? They don't believe that any amount of extra effort is going to move them past that failure, right? So they tend to give up. They feel threatened by other people's success, and they feel threatened by criticism and feedback. They take it very personally. So people with a growth mindset, on the other hand, they really believe, like, I could pretty much learn anything. And once I learn it, if I stick with it, I'll probably get pretty good at it, right? And I can go through cycles of learning. So they want to learn. They're less invested in how they look or how they appear to others. They're very coachable. They love challenges. So as Ural mentioned, they put themselves right in front of a challenge. They take it on as a way to kind of test their own resiliency and grittiness. They see failures as an opportunity to learn and to grow and move past them. They understand that their effort, the effort that they put into their challenges is a path to mastery. That they truly believe that they can master whatever it is that they apply themselves to, and they're actually inspired by other people's success. So they're the people, and you probably saw this in the boot camp, where if I saw someone that really inspired me, like, I would gravitate to that person, and I would create a relationship with them. I would want to learn from them. They reach out to mentors, people who are the top in their field, because they really feel that these are traits and skills that they can learn. So I don't know if you've seen this yet. So that's Michael Phelps. That's what they're calling it, his death stare, right? So this is all over the internet right now. But what Duckworth was looking at, she wanted to know, like, can we predict who's going to be successful, right, in any population? So in all of these areas that she was researching, what she found that in some cases, predictors for success were pretty field specific. So in business, right, and it was an appetite for taking financial risks, artists, this like strong desire to create something, athletes, right, competitiveness. And you can't not look at this thing and wonder what's going on in his mind. So this was right before, I think it was the 400-meter race, and this is his like #1 rival. And so his rival was dancing, in front of him, kind of taunting him, in the warm-up.
The South African guy.
Yeah, yes. And you have to actually watch the video of it, because you can see this increasing intensity and focus. And then, he proceeds to like blow him out of the water. But in most fields, what she found is that people who were really high achievers, right? People who were very, very successful in their fields, they were never satisfied. They were constantly trying to improve themselves. They had a never give up attitude. They could move forward after failure again, because they didn't see failure as a permanent state. And also luck and timing, right, as factors, right? And that should sound really familiar to you too, right? But there's only one thing that emerged as a significant predictor of success across every field, right? And so that was grit, right? Just good old-fashioned grit. Is it surprising to you? So in my generation, this isn't surprising. This is what we were taught every day: hard work, grittiness, stick to it. This was like part of our values that we grew up with, yet I tend to think we've moved a little bit away from that, right? And I know personally that in raising my own children, I didn't really emphasize grittiness. I was one of the many baby boomers who kind of coddled and sheltered. They call us helicopter parents, right? So I tried to make life a little bit easier for my children than it was for me, right? And as a result, they're less gritty than I am, right? Who was it that said we need to disrupt parenting? Yeah. So I think this is like at least one of those things that maybe we should start to focus on is really making sure that our children experience some hardship in their lives. So the question for me when I read her book is that if grit is a primary sort of predictor of success, then why aren't we teaching it, right? So, but we don't really know much about it, right? We know about it anecdotally from our own lives and our own experiences if you were from the baby boomer generation, right, or before. But it worries me what our children are going to teach to their children, right? If our children are less gritty than we are, you know, and they carry that forward, you know, how is that going to like portend the future? Yeah.
Have you seen any studies around reduced grittiness as in correlation with the uptake of technology in children, and how often?
No one's done that research yet. In fact, there's really no longitudinal studies on grittiness. I mean, this is really, really kind of early in her research. So there's a lot of potential to look into. You know, a lot of different arenas where grittiness is a primary trait, right? Like entrepreneurship. And that was kind of where my mind went immediately. Intuitively, I know I was a serial entrepreneur. I knew that grittiness was a huge part of my success, as was luck and timing. You know, all of the other factors, not so sure about, right? But those three I knew for sure were significant indicators of my own personal success, right? But as an educator now, I also know that we're not really developing it in our courses. Simply getting a degree is not that hard anymore. Maybe at MIT it might be a little bit, but different. But it's, you know, our students aren't, you know, necessarily developing grit in the classroom, and we don't intentionally teach it, right? Modern parenting approaches, right? It's really not developing it, and millennials don't demonstrate it on the job. One of the biggest complaints with employers, right? They get tasked with a hard challenge and they're out of there. And they tend to last about 2.5 years, right, in every job. And no one really knows why, right? Maybe they're just hitting like what they perceive as their own personal ceiling in terms of abilities, and no one's developing them, and so they bail, right? We don't know. So what she talks about, Angela Duckworth talks about, is this thing called the magic of the hard thing rule, right? And it sets up kind of a virtuous cycle of what I call the virtuous cycle of grit, when you have to go through repetitive cycles of doing really hard things, right? It's a cycle of like struggle, right? Make a little progress, gain a little bit of confidence, and then, you know, you're willing to try something harder, right? And then you continue to go through that cycle, right? So she truly believes that grit can be learned. We can teach it, right? Students can learn it. Doesn't really depend on your IQ or your circumstances. So Chicago public school system, like, demonstrated that kids, right, and who primarily lived on the lower end of the economic scale, who had hardships related to their own personal safety, resources, right, can be taught to be gritty as well. That any significant effort you make ultimately counts twice towards your goal, right? So every time you go through one of these cycles, you gain even more confidence via your progress, right? Your willingness to try something harder, right? But what was interesting to me, right? So you watch people go through these processes, and you know, and you wonder, like, is it just all agony, 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 right? And then you know, your grittiness scale goes up a little bit, and you're willing to try it again. And it's like agony, agony, and who would do that, right? Who would right? We do. We do, because we come back here every year. We still can't figure out why, right? We don't know. I mean, we're either like completely crazy people, right? But it's really, well, we won't answer that question. Not now. Anyway. So with respect to parenting, right? So we have to ask this question now, right? So what's better for them? Like really, really high standards, or it's okay. You're okay. You'll be fine. And one thing we all know, that all of you know, is that the MIT Bootcamp develops grit. You all know that intuitively now. So when Andrew asked me to come and talk, first thing I asked was, are they going to do the boot camp first and then the teacher boot camp? It's like, is this sort of redundant at this point? Because, two things you know at this point. You know whether or not you're gritty, right? And you know how important grittiness is to doing really hard things, like the boot camp, right? Or entrepreneurship. So, I'm not telling stories, but we also know how hard it can get, right? And what you can push yourself to. In my boot camp, right, everyone thought we were like the team who had no conflict, and they could not have been more wrong. And I won't tell you any more about that. But this, when people are pushed through cycles of really, really hard things, right? It brings things out of you, characteristics, traits, and qualities that, you probably don't want to put on the internet, or you hope someone doesn't have a video camera. So some of the things that I thought about when I finished my boot camp, I was really, really excited to take the DE process back into my classroom, right? And I felt like, I could do this. I could make this happen. I could recreate this experience because it was so life-changing for me. And I wanted to give this to my students. I wanted them to have that same transformative experience that I had, right? And so what happened was when the first time that I tried to teach DE in my classroom, it really failed. I mean, it just totally failed. For a lot of different reasons that I had to reflect on later. I didn't make them gritty. They didn't sweat. I had 15 weeks though, right? So we had 5 days. I had 15 weeks. And so I've been chasing this thing for the last 2 years. How can I replicate the bootcamp experience in a 15-week program? And then, more importantly, how can I prepare them for the rigors of the 24 steps? Because using the 24 steps is hard. It's really, really hard. And it takes a lot longer than 5 days, right? You guys did a lot of prep work. But 15 weeks, right? I found it was maybe too much time. So I wanted to extend Duckworth's research into the field of entrepreneurship because I understood intuitively that this is another thing that I really wanted to understand. So I spent 7 weeks in Silicon Valley this summer just interviewing the top entrepreneurs in their field. And it was really hard to access them. I thought, I'm just going to go to Silicon Valley and they're all going to want to talk to me, right? But I really had to work my network to find these people and get in front of them and talk with them. And I essentially asked them the same 3 questions, who are the most successful entrepreneurs in Silicon Valley, right? Who do you know? I want to talk to you, and I want to know about who you know. And what are they like, and what sets them apart from the other 97% that fail, right? And again, consistently, what I heard was perseverance, right? So talent, yes, absolutely. Luck, timing, absolutely. But it was the ones who could move past failure. And every one of these entrepreneurs have failed multiple times. The reason that they're here and others are not here is that kept pushing through failure. And they kept trying and they kept pivoting. But it was interesting when I was talking to them. So I realized there was another type of entrepreneur in Silicon Valley. Actually, it was the most predominant type of entrepreneur in Silicon Valley. And they kept bringing this term of the wantrepreneur. And I said, what's a wantrepreneur, right? And I think this is, this really illustrates it really, really well. So these are folks that they get obsessed with their ideas. They love their ideas. and they love their business. They don't love business in general. They just love the idea of being entrepreneurs, of setting their own hours, and being their own boss, and making a whole lot of money. And I also found that they're really, really easy to find. They're everywhere, and they're really easy to talk to because they want to talk to you. All they want to do is talk, right? I mean, so you get in a meeting, and and you're looking at your watch like, I gotta go, right? And it's like totally it's like it's so hard to get like 5 minutes with a real entrepreneur, and then they'll take up your whole day. So one of the things that I noticed is that in my student population, I like Bill, I kind of saw the just curious and the ready to goes, but I realized I had a lot of entrepreneurs in my classroom too. So some of the like common mistakes that the entrepreneurs make, and even the just curious, when they haven't even made a start yet, they don't know essentially what they're doing, is what I call anti-hustle. So they do everything other than what needs to be done, right? At the time. So they like obsess about their ideas. They don't really focus on trying to find customers, people willing to pay for their product. They spend time increasing their network rather than using it, right? So they're really good at networking. They'll chat anyone up because they have a lot of time to do it. But when it comes time to like actually using their network to get shit done, they don't do it. It's really bizarre. And then they anticipate and solve problems they don't even have, right? It's like they look out into the future and try to like overlay some sense of certainty, right, in a really uncertain environment. So they act on assumptions, right, rather than real data, because they never talk to customers, right? Never talk to customers. They continue to design new features, right? Optimize their website, create their logo, but they do all of this in isolation, and they don't rely on real customer data because they never get out of the building, and they don't measure what counts, right? Because they don't even know what to measure. They don't even have anything to measure, right, until they start talking to customers. So it's essentially just a failure to get shit done. In my classroom, right, so these are the questions I'm asked every semester. So it's really obvious that there's some really basic skill sets that the students lack when they're trying to create a startup. So like, how do we know we're building the right thing, right? And it's, think about that question. How would you know you're building the right thing? How would you know? Your customers are going to tell you, right? But they're not talking to customers, right? So they get stuck in this like agonizing over like, are we building the right thing? It's like rather than just going to talk to customers, how can we get customers to talk to us, right? What do we measure, and when do we measure it? And like, how do I build a great team that can go to the distance? How do we keep people accountable, right? To do that, and how do I know when to call it quits and when to keep trying? Because there's this conflict between never giving up and failing fast, right? So I was, again, trying to figure out how to structure my class to answer those questions, to rapidly onboard entrepreneurial traits that I knew they needed, like grit. But I was really struggling. And in a 15-week program, so typically in a classroom, this is the approach we take. We teach them a methodology, and then we put them through the process, right? So here's my student population. So I roughly have about 30% just curious, very few ready to goes, and then lots and lots of entrepreneurs, right? So it's really difficult, from the starting gate to figure out how to pace them, because they're all going to move at a very different pace. So the 24 steps really is for the ready to go. That's my experience of it. And so the just curious and the entrepreneurs, they have a really difficult time coming up with ideas, and they go into analysis paralysis pretty easily, and they just get stuck there. And 24 steps, if you want to teach it in one semester, a 15-week semester, you have to hit it hard. And you have to, it's kind of right from the starting gate. And even if you do, they're still going to get stuck in a couple of key places: the ideation and also the PMR, right? They get stuck there, and sometimes like endlessly, it's a stopper, and it's a demotivator. Like a lot of times, like they want to give up or they'll drop the class because they're not in that cycle of like hard sprints, doing hard things, having a few successes, gaining some confidence, and then moving forward, right? So outcomes were poor. I mean, at best, we would have teams who had proven concepts, no traction, right? They could win a competition, but no one would invest in them, right? There's a big difference between a competition and an actual investor pitch. So what I did was I transitioned to what I call the 7-day launch and learn approach, right? Which is based on three ideas that I think are important to entrepreneurship. So coming up with an idea, really, really fast, executing on it, learning from that execution, right? Learning how to hustle, get out of the building, get shit done, essentially, and learn from your failure. Because when you go through these hard sprints like this, without, a lot of analysis, you're going to fail. You're going to fail often, right? But you're going to fail fast. So my goals were to convert the entrepreneurs and just curious to ready to go so I could get them going with DE. I wanted them to do really hard things in rapid learning cycles, so they could sort of avoid all the distractions, that are common for early entrepreneurs. I wanted them to talk to actual customers. As afraid as they were to do it, I was going to make them do it. I mean, I was going to put them in an environment where they had to do it or they were going to fail, right? So they could also they would know what to build, right? So once you talk to your customers now, you're not agonizing over that question anymore. So they could really understand failure very differently. Failure is just another chance to go through the cycle again and do it better, right? Now that they have a little more confidence, they've got a little bit more of the behaviors and traits of third and fourth time entrepreneurs, okay? So what I found is that it really onboarded a lot of the traits that were common to third and fourth time entrepreneurs. So these were the folks that you saw on my previous slide, the ones who were successful, right? They weren't successful on their first time, their second time, right? So they had already gone through these hard cycles and they knew what it took to create a successful startup, right? To find a good team. So grittiness, right? The ability to identify your personal weaknesses, which I'm sure you all understand after boot camp, right? You know where your weak areas are. How to find a great idea to work on really fast and how to find a great team to work on it, right? And just the ability to hustle and get things done. So this is what it looks like. How much time do I have?
Like 10 minutes.
Okay, cool. Here's what it looks like. I'm going to go through this a little bit rapidly, but Andrew's going to put my slides on Dropbox so you could look at it in more detail. And then if you want to ask me anything about this afterwards, I'm happy to talk to you. So this is what I did. Day one, we do ideation and team formation. So I have them form teams, and I put them through an ideation exercise, very much like the one that we did for Invictus. So Invictus, when I came into the boot camp as a mentor, I came in kind of halfway through. I got here like Wednesday around 7 p.m., I think. And we had a mentor meeting, and Chichu had all of the teams ranked on the board, right, in terms of how they were performing, who needed what, right? And Invictus was dead last, right? They were underperforming on a lot of different levels. There was conflict. And so it was kind of like, Chichu said, we need a Navy SEAL intervention, for this team, right? And we just happened to have a Navy SEAL in the room. So, Sean was picked, and then stupidly I raised my hand and said, I think I can help. And so we were like, okay, you guys go. And so what happened was I came in, they had nothing. They had no idea. And I could totally relate to that because we were in the same position 2 years ago. Like Marius came in, Wednesday night, 10 o'clock, or sorry, Thursday night, 10 o'clock, right before demo day, totally broke our business model. And then just like, hey, good luck, guys. And he was like, out of there. And we were, so I totally I had empathy, but I still had to get them moving. So, so based on what I did, this experiment I did in my classroom, I knew that I had to put them through like a rapid cycle of really hard shit. And so I did that. I put them through an ideation process that was blunt and probably rude. Would you agree, Giral? Yeah. So it was really about eliminating bad ideas really quickly, and just getting to the good ones. And they did it. And then from that moment on, they were locked in that room until demo day, essentially. Like they had commitment, they had grittiness, I mean, and they went from the lowest performing team into the finals, right? That's performance, that's rapid onboarding of those kinds of skills. So, they get to spend one day on the idea, that's it. And then they choose the best one and they move on. So the criteria, right? So criteria for this is they have to build, test, modify, and sell really quickly. Right? So if your idea is so complex you cannot do that, that idea is off the table, right? The team must currently have the skills to execute on it. So one of the things that we did with Invictus is we had them list out all of their skill sets, and they couldn't come up with an idea outside of their skill sets. It had to be complementary to their skills. So they had to have knowledge and domain expertise. They had to have, the technical skills or business skills or engineering, whatever they needed, and the passion to do it. They had to want to do it, right? So nobody wants to work on something that they just simply don't care about, and you won't stick to it, right? So that's criteria. Then, so the idea team fit. So first-time entrepreneurs, they like to develop these really complex ideas that they can't execute on, right? They just don't have the capacity or the time. And especially if they're bootstrapping. So sometimes, you have to give up those ideas because, or maybe put them on the table because you just don't have the time or the skill sets for them. They had to focus on solving a problem and selling the solution really fast, and a singular focus on doing things that lead to a paying customer. So this, I make them sign this. This is something they absolutely have to commit to. So day 2 is the MVP, right? The idea is to do the smallest amount of work to get something into the hands of the customer as quickly as possible, right? So, but I caution them, don't overemphasize the minimum and emphasize the viable, because it really has to, if you create something that's so junky and sloppy that the customer doesn't even can't identify what it is, you're not going to impress them. Second is that if it doesn't at least have as many features as whatever's out there currently on the market, they're not going to want it, right? So that's the sort of the criteria for the MVP. And then I asked them how they can mimic the customer experience of the end product as much as possible, as quickly as possible. So they don't have to do the full build out, right? But sometimes you can kind of manually, especially if it's a service, manually demonstrate what your product can do without actually building all those features. And you must be able to put something into the hands of your customers and ask them for money at the end of the week in 7 days. They have 7 days, right? Your family can't be customers. So my students always, they try, they respect, the hard process, but they still try to cheat it all the time. So the third day, I have them choose a business name, right? It has to be simple. You're not going to agonize over it, right? And make sure it's not taken so that they can get the domain name. Create a Twitter handle and a Facebook page. Fourth day, they build a website, right? So I make sure that they have someone with the ability to build a website on their team. Otherwise, I have to partner with some folks in the media lab to come over and help them with this. So they start with a landing page on WordPress, or they can use Wix, right? They're going to pay a little bit if they're going to use WordPress. But again, I don't have them buy really expensive textbooks, so it's like you can invest in this, but that's ultimately the portal through which they're going to sell their product, right? They have to pre-sell through content that is actionable, right? So at some point there's going to be a click to buy button. They start communicating with their customers, right? Learning from their responses. They capture customer email, so we use MailChimp. There's other tools out there. On the 5th day, they get their product in front of actual customers. So this is the beachhead market. So they're only really trying to sell to influencers at this point, right? And I always have to remind them that free users are not paying customers. So a lot of times they try to come back and say, well, look, we have customers, It's like, really, how much did you charge for it? Nothing, nothing. On day 6, right, I tell them this is where they have to start looking at their data. So I tell them that really they have to think about the fact that they're creating a startup that is tasked with actually selling a product in 7 days. So set reasonable targets. And to measure what matters. So we talk about the one metric that matters, right? And that's at different stages. But always up front, it's like, what your customers are saying, right? How many conversions are you getting? And, and then, whether or not the feedback on your product is something that, indicates whether you should move forward or stop. Solve problems you're having right now. Right now is your biggest problem, how to get customers. Don't think about your logo. Don't think about, continuing to, create or implement features that your customers aren't asking for, right? And then, so aim for 5 paying customers, and then, but don't get too excited, right, until you actually sell to people that you don't know. It's really easy to sell on a college campus. You can, you can get your dorm mates to buy your product if you tell them, God, I'm going to fail this class. Like, if you don't buy this thing, right? So, yeah, money back guarantee, right? And then day 7 is launch day, right? So they have to put up their live website, has to have a payment button. We use PayPal, right, just to get it done really quickly. Include as many options as you can to make sure your customers can contact you, right? And then announce your launch. So, you're out there while you're doing customer discovery, like getting people to get onto your website and give them your email addresses. So I always tell them, give something away. If it's a service, that's super easy, right? If it's a product, give away your knowledge about something that they care about. But you'll really learn very quickly whether people want what you're offering and how much they're going to pay for it, right? So instead of agonizing over pricing strategy, put it out there for what you think it's worth, and they'll tell you. They'll vote with their wallets, right? They'll tell you whether or not they're going to pay that. Okay, so so some outcomes for this, and again, I've only done it once. And when I did it, I put them actually through 7 cycles, and then I found I didn't have enough time to implement DE. So I'm scaling back, and they're going to do 4 cycles now. So what I found is that they hate it. The first 2 cycles, they hate it. And I'm pretty sure I'm going to get the worst student evaluations ever, and I'm going to get fired, lose my job. But what's interesting is once they get into the 3rd cycle, this is what I call the innovation engine starts. It's all of a sudden this light goes on. They start getting really excited. They have enough of those sort of entrepreneurial traits onboarded to get them moving forward. And now they feel a lot more confidence that they can do it, especially with customer discovery. Now they'll talk to anybody. They'll go and talk to the president, right? And they'll tell them way too many things about what's going on in my class. Essentially what they're doing is they're mimicking sort of the very lean approach of successful entrepreneurs. So they learn from real data. So they don't sit and agonize over assumptions. They don't act on assumptions. They base their decisions on what their customers are telling them, right? Which is the lean product approach. So they're not doing endlessly cycling through these things that were stoppers before for the just curious and the entrepreneurs, right? And they get shit done. They can hustle. It's just really, as an educator, it's so exciting to see. So these are kind of two reinforcing approaches, right? So the virtuous cycle of grit looks very much like the validated learning loop, right? So, you know, build, measure, learn really complements this idea that, you know, you've got to struggle through something really, really hard to kind of retrain your brain that you can do this. Like, this is doable. I can learn this. I can execute on it, right? And when I execute, if I fail, I just keep moving forward, right? And you will get better at it. The students do get better. They're pretty, you know, most of them they're pretty horrible at entrepreneurship when they first start. And they're not ready for DE, right? But after a couple of cycles of this, you know, they're much more willing to take it on. So I do 4 cycles, right? The third and fourth cycle, they go faster, their ideas are better, they're more confident, right? They're way better at team formation. They know who they don't want to work with, right? Easy, right? So, you know, with each cycle, they mix up their teams. So it's really easy. Team formation, fast, easy, right? The teams are really invested, right? And they know that they can rely on the people that they've brought onto their teams to go the distance, right? They understand what to measure, right? And when to measure it. I don't even have to teach that anymore. It's so great. So what I love about this is it prepares them for DE, right? But DE is really complementary at this point. It doesn't look like this big challenge that they can't handle. They look at it and they're like, you know, they look at it like a seasoned entrepreneur. This is great shit, and I can get stuff done here, right, with this. So, you know, the thing about DE is it mirrors, you know, the build, measure, build, launch, measure, build, measure, launch, in that you have to run all of these little micro tests, right, in every one of the steps, right? So you know if you're going to move forward or not, right? So you're constantly testing. And it continues to get that like iterative engine turning. So yeah, I passed this test. I can move on to the next step, right? It is challenging though, and it is not for the non-gritty. I don't know, how many of you have actually gone through the full 24 steps? Like all the way through. Yeah, it's hard, and it takes a long time, right? Even for seasoned entrepreneurs, right? So it takes a lot of cross-functional synergy on a badass team, right? People that you can count on that are really gritty. And, you know, that just wasn't built into my student population. Okay, so what I found is the launch and learn approach, it builds entrepreneurial traits and prepares the students, like really, really well, right? So they can handle progressively harder tasks. DE is structured that way. They don't get stopped endlessly at any one step. They following, it also teaches them that when you follow through on really hard things, right, you're coachable. You're so much more coachable, right? So you kind of get, you kind of understand what you need to know and how to find really smart mentors to help you and to listen to them when they're talking to you. Another failure I saw in some of the teams. Okay? What your priorities are, like how to know what to do and when to do it and get things done, right? And then it really changes their attitude towards failure. It reinforces that growth mindset, like I can do this, and you know what? I can take on even harder and harder tasks. It exposes your weaknesses really quickly, right? Like Bootcamp. DE, when you're moving through it, you realize if you're not good at financials and you don't have a finance person on your team, you're in trouble, right? And there's no chicken exit. You just can't give up, right? It's like, and DE will tell you if you should move forward. And it gives you the confidence, you know, to do it. Like if I pass, you know, 17 steps and I'm still, that engine's going and I'm still, you know, with the path, you know, I'm motivated to get to the next one. And I want to learn. I want to know which of those steps I'm going to be stopped at, right? So I think I've used up all my time. So email me. This is my contact information. I will continue. I would love to continue to try different things, different approaches with all of you to help all of us be more successful, bringing DE into our classrooms or our accelerators, our environments, and maybe share some ideas on our students, what our students look like, how to adapt it to different contexts, and how we can ensure that what we're doing in our classrooms is really serving the students' best interests, even if it's really, really hard and they hate it. Ultimately, they'll be more gritty and probably more successful. All right, thank you for listening.